Chapter 2 The Atrocity at the Museum. Algernon Harris emerged from the BMT subway at the 59th Street and Fifth Avenue interest, and began nervously to pace the sidewalk in front of a large yellow sign, which bore the discouraging caption, "Buses do not stop here." Harris was most eager to secure a bus, and it was obvious from the expectant manner in which he hailed the first one to pass that he hadn't the faintest notion he had taken up his post on the wrong side of the street. Indeed, it was not until 4 buses had passed him by that he awoke to the gravity of his predicament, and began to propel his person in the direction of the legitimate stop zone. Algernon Harris was abnormally and tragically upset, but even a man trembling on the verge of a neuropathic collapse can remain superficially politic, and it isn't surprising that when he ascended into his bus and encountered on a conspicuous seat his official superior, Dr. George Francis Scullard, he should have nodded, smiled, and responded with an unwavering amiability to the questions that were shot at him. "I got your telegram yesterday," murmured the president of the Manhattan Museum of Fine Arts, "and I caught the first train down. Am I too late for the inquest?" Algernon nodded. "The coroner, a chap named Henry Weigel, took my evidence and rendered a decision on the spot. The condition of Ullman's body would have not permitted of delay. I've never before imagined that putrefaction could proceed with such incredible rapidity." Scholar frowned. "And the verdict?" "Heart failure. The coroner was very positive that anxiety and shock were the sole causes of Ullman's total collapse." "But you said something about his face being horribly disfigured." "Yes, it had been rendered loathsome by plastic surgery. Weigel was hideously agitated until I explained that Ullman had merely fallen into the hands of a skilful Oriental surgeon with sadistic inclination in the course of his archaeological explorations. I explained to him that many of our field workers returned, disfigured, and that Ullman had merely endured an exaggeration of the customary martyrdom." "And you believe that plastic surgery could account for the repellent and gruesome changes you mentioned in your night letter? The shocking prolongation of the poor devil's nose, the flattening and broadening of his ears?" Algernon winced. "I must believe it, sir. It is impossible sanely to entertain any other explanation. The coroner's assistant was a little incredulous at first, until Weigel pointed out to him that an unwholesome precedent they would set, if by even so much as hinting that the phenomenon wasn't pathologically explicable. We would play right into the hands of the spiritualists, Weigel explained. An officer of the police isn't at liberty to adduce a hypothesis that the district attorney's office wouldn't approve of. The newspapers would pounce on a thing like that and play it up disgustingly. Mr. Harris has supplied us with an explanation which seems adequate to cover the facts, and with your permission I shall file a verdict of natural death." The president coughed and shifted uneasily in his seat. "I am glad that the coroner took such a sensible view of the matter. Had he been a recreant individual and raised objections, we should have come in for considerable unpleasant publicity. I shudder whenever I see reference to the museum in the popular press. It's always the morbid and sensational aspects of our work that they stress, and there's never the slightest attention paid to accuracy." For a moment, Dr. Scullard was silent. Then he cleared his throat and recapitulated, in a slightly more empathetic form, the question that he put to Algernon originally. "But you said in your letter that Ullman's nose revolted and sickened you, that it had become a loathsome greenish trunk, almost a foot in length, which continued to move about for hours after Ullman's heart stopped beating. Could your operation hypothesis account for such an appalling abnormality?" Algernon took a deep breath. I can't pretend that I wasn't astounded and appalled and well, quite frightened, and so lost to discretion that I made no attempt to conceal the way I felt from the coroner. I could not remain in the room while they were examining the body. And yet you succeeded in convincing the coroner that he could justly render a verdict of natural death. You must understand me, sir. The coroner wanted to render such a verdict. My explanation merely supplied him with a straw to clutch at. I was trembling in every limb when I made it, and it must have been obvious to him that we were in the presence of, well, something unthinkable. But without the plastic surgery assumption, we should have had nothing whatever to cling to. And do you still get your reluctant assent to such an assumption? Oh, now more than ever, and my assent is no longer reluctant, for I am succeeded in convincing myself that a surgeon endowed with miraculous skill could have effected that transformation I described in my letter. Miraculous skill? Oh, I use the word in a merely, mundane sense. When one stops to consider what astounding advances plastic surgery has made in England and America during the past decade, it is, impossible to disbelieve that the human frame, will soon become more malleable than wax beneath the scalpels of our surgeons, and that beings will appear in our midst with bodies so grotesquely distorted that the superstitious will ascribe their advent to the supernatural, and we can adduce more than a surgical miracle to account for the horror that poor Ullman became without for a moment encroaching on the dubious domain of, that superphysical. Everyone knows how extensive the ductless glands regulate the growth and shape of our bodies. A change in the quantity or quality of secretion in any one of the glands may throw that entire human mechanism out of gear. Terrible and unthinkable changes have been known to occur in the adult body during the course of diseases involving glandular intestability. We once thought the human beings invariably ceased to grow at 21 or 22, but we now know that growth may continue till the middle age, and even till the very onset of seniality, and that frequently such growth does not culminate in a mere increase in, stature or in girth. Doubtless you've heard of that rare and hideously deforming glandular malady, acromegaly. It is characterized by an abnormal overgrowth of the skull and face, and the small bones of the extremities, and its victims become in a short time, tragic caricatures of humanity. Their entire face assumes a more massive cast, but the overgrowth is most pronounced in the region of the jawbones. In exceptional cases, the face has been known to attain a length of nearly a foot. But it is not so much the size as, the revolting primitiveness of the face which sets the victims of the hideous disease so tragically apart from their fellows. The features not only grow, but they take on an almost ape-like aspect. So the disease advances, even the skull becomes revoltingly simian in its conformation. In belief, the victims of acromegaly become in short while almost indistinguishable from very primitive and the brutest types of human ancestors, such as Homo neanderthalenses and the unmentionable enormous broad caricature from Broken Hill, Rhodesia, which Sir Arthur Keith has called the most unqualifiedly repulsive physiognomy in the entire gallery of fossil men. The disease of acromegaly is perhaps a more certain indication of man's origins than all the missing links that anthropologists have exhumed. It proves incontestably that we still carry within our bodies the mechanism of evolutionary retrogression, and that when something interferes with the normal functions of our glands, we are very apt to return, at least physically, to our aboriginal status. And since we know that mere insufficiency or superabundance of glandular secretions can work such devastating changes, it can turn men virtually into Neanderthals or great apes. What is there really unaccountable in the alteration I witnessed in poor Ullman? Some Oriental diabolists merely 10 years in advance of the West in the sphere of plastic surgery, and with a knowledge of glandular therapeutics no greater than the possessed by Doctors Noel Paton and Schaeffer, might easily have wrought such an abomination. Or perhaps, as I have hinted before, that no surgery was involved. Perhaps this fiend has learned so much about our glands that he can send man back and back through the mists of time, back past the great apes and the primitive mammals and the carnivorous dinosaurs to their primordial sires. Suppose, now and it is an awful thought I know, suppose that some creature closely resembling what Ormond became was once our ancestor, that 100 million years ago a gigantic Bacterian shape with trunk-like appendages and great flapping ears paddled through the warm primeval seas, or stretched its leathery length on the banks of the Premian slime. Mr. Scollard turned sharply and plucked at his subordinate's sleeve. "There's a crowd in front of the museum," he muttered. "See there?" Algernon started, and, rising instantly, pressed the signal bell above his companion's head. "Oh, we'll have to walk back," he muttered despondently. "I should have watched the street numbers." His pessimism proved well-founded. The bus continued relentlessly on its way for 4 additional blocks, and then came so abruptly to a stop that Mr. Scollard was subjected to the ignominy of being obliged to sit for an instant on the spacious lap of a middle-aged stout woman, who resented the encroachment with a furious glare. "I've good mind to report you," she shouted to the bus conductor as she lowered his portly person to the sidewalk. "I've a damn good mind." "Oh, let it pass." Algernon laid a pacifying arm upon his companion's arm. "We've got no time to argue. Something dreadful has occurred at the museum. I just saw 2 policemen enter the building, and those tall men walking up and down on the opposite side of the street are reporters. There's Wells of the Tribune, and, Thompson of the Times, and—" Mr. Scollard gripped his subordinate's arm. "Tell me," he demanded, "did you put the statue on exhibition?" Algernon nodded. "Of course, I had it carried to Alcove K, Wing C, last night. After the inquest on poor Ormond, I was besieged by reporters. They wanted to know all about the fetish, and of course I had to tell them it would go on exhibition eventually. They would have returned every day for weeks to pester me, if I hadn't assured them that we'd respect the public clamour to that extent at least. Yesterday afternoon all the papers ran specials about it. The news graphic gave it a front-page write-up. I remained in my office until 11, and all evening, at half-minute intervals, some emotionally overcharged numbskull would ring up and ask me when I was going to exhibit the thing, and whether it really looked as repulsive as its photographs, and what kind of stone it was made of, and, oh God, I was too nervous and wrought up to be bothered that way, and I decided it would be best to satisfy the public's idiotic curiosity by permitting them to view the thing today. The 2 men were walking briskly in the direction of the museum. Besides, there was no longer any necessity of my keeping it in the office. I had had it measured and photographed, and I knew that Harrison and Smithson wouldn't want to take a cast of it until next week, and I couldn't have chosen a safer place for it than Alcove K. It's roped off, you know, only 2 paces removed from the door. Cindy can see it all night from his station in the corridor. By the time that Algernon and Mr. Scollard arrived at the museum, the crowd had reached alarming proportions. They were obliged to fight their way through a solid phalanx of excited men and women, who impeded their progress with elbow-thrusting aggressiveness, and scant respect for their dignity, and even in the vestibules they were repulsed with discourtesy. A red-headed policeman glared savagely at them from behind horn-rimmed spectacles, and brought them to a halt with a threatening gesture. "You got to keep out," he shouted. "If you ain't got a police card, you got to keep out." "What's happened here?" demanded Algernon authoritatively. "A guy's been bumped off. If you ain't got a police card, you've got to... Algernon produced a calling card and thrust it into the officer's face. "I'm the curator of archaeology," he affirmed angrily. "I guess I've a right to enter my own museum." The officer's manner softened perceptibly. "Oh, then I guess it's all right. The chief told me I wasn't to keep out any of the guys that work here. How about your friend?" "Oh, you can safely admit him," murmured Algernon with a smile. "He's president of the museum." The policeman did not seem too astonished. He regarded Mr. Scholar dubiously for a moment. Then he shrugged his shoulders and stepped complacently aside. An attendant greeted them excitedly as they emerged from the turnstile. "It's awful, sir," he gasped, addressing Mr. Scollard. "Kinney's been murdered. Knifed, sir. He's all cut and mangled. I shouldn't have recognized him if it weren't for his clothes. There's nothing left on his face, sir." Algernon turned pale. When did this happen?" he gasped. The attendant shook his head. "I can't say, Mr. Harris. It must have been some time last night, but I can't say exactly when. The first we knew of it was when Mr. Williams came running down the stairs with his hands all bloodied. There was at 8 this morning, about 2 hours ago. I'd just got in, and all the other attendants were in the cloakroom, getting into their uniforms. That is, well, except Williams. Williams usually arrives about a half-hour before the rest of us. He likes to come early and have a chat with Kinney before the doors open." The attendant's face was convulsed with terror, and he spoke with considerable difficulty. "I was the only one to see him come down the stairs. I was standing about here, and as soon as he came into sight, I knew that something was wrong with him. He went from side to side of the stairs, clung to the rails, to keep himself from falling. His face was as white as paper." Algernon's eyes did not leave the attendant's face. "Go on," he urged. "But he opened his mouth very wide when he saw me. He was like as if he wanted to shout, and couldn't. There wasn't a sound came out of him." The attendant cleared his throat. "I didn't think he'd ever reach the bottom of the stairs, and I called out for the boys in the cloakroom to lend me a hand." "What happened then?" "Well, he didn't speak for a long time. One of the boys gave him some whiskey out of a flask. The rest of us just stood about and said soothing things to him, but he was trembling all over, and we couldn't quiet him down. He kept throwing his head about and pointing toward the stairs, and foam collected all over his mouth. It was ghastly. 'What's wrong, Jim?' I said to him. 'What you see?' 'The worm of hell,' he said. 'The devil's awful mascot.' He said other things I can't repeat, sir. I'm a God-fearing man, and there are blasphemies it's best to forget you ever heard. But I'll tell you what he said when he got through talking about the worm out of hell. He said Kinney's upstairs, stretch out her back, and there ain't a drop of blood in his veins." We got up the stairs quicker than lightning after he told us that. We didn't know just what his crazy words meant, but, well, the blood on his hands made us sure something pretty terrible had happened. They kind of confirmed what we feared, sir, if you get what I mean." Algernon nodded. And you found Kinney, well, dead?" "Worse than that, sir. He was all black and shrunken, and looking as though he'd been wearing clothes about 4 sizes too large. His face was gone, sir, all eating away like. We picked him up. He wasn't much heavier than a little boy, and we laid him out on a bench and called our H. Never seen so much blood in my life. The floor was slippery with it. The big stone animal you had us carried down to Alcove Cay last night was all dripping with it, especially its trunk. Made me sort of sick. I never liked to look at blood." "You think someone attacked Cinny?" He looked that way, Mr. Harris, like as if someone went at him with a knife. But it must have been an awful big knife. A regular butcher's knife. That ain't a very nice way of putting it, sir, but, well, that's how it struck me. Like as if someone mistook him for a piece of mutton. And what else did you find when you examined him? Oh, we didn't do much examining. We just let him lie on the bench till we got through phoning for the police. Mr. Williamson did the talking, sir. A look of relief crept into the attendant's eyes. The police said we wasn't to disturb the boy further, which suited us fine. There wasn't one of us didn't want to give poor Cinny a wide berth. What did the police do when they arrived? Well, they asked us about 1,000,000 crazy questions, sir. Was Mr. Cinny disfigured in the war? Was Mr. Cinny in the habit of wearing a mask over his face? And had Mr. Cinny received any threatening letters from Chinamen or Hindus? And we all told them no. They seemed to get kind of frightened. And if it ain't murder, they said, we're up against something that ain't natural. But it's got to be murder. All we have to do is get hold of the Chinaman. Algernon didn't want to hear more. Brushing the attendant ungratefully aside, he went dashing up the stairs, 3 steps at a time. Mr. Scholar followed with an ashen face. They were met in the upper corridor by a tall, loose-jointed man in shabby, ill-fitted clothes, who arrested their progress with a scowl and a torrent of impatient abuse. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. "Didn't I give orders that no one was to come up here? I got nothing to say to you. You're too damn noisy. If you want the lowdown on this affair, you got to wait outside till we get through questioning attendants." "See here," said Algernon impatiently. "This gentleman is president of the museum, and he has perfect right to go where he chooses." The tall man waxed apologetic. "I thought you were a couple of newspaper Johns," he murmured confusedly. "We haven't anything even remotely resembling a clue, but those guys keep popping in here every 10 minutes to cross-examine us. They're worse than prosecuting attorneys. Come right this way, sir." He led them past a little knot of attendants and photographers and fingerprint experts to the northerly part of the corridor. "There's the boy," he said, pointing toward a sheeted form which lay sprawled on a low bench near the window. "I'll be grateful if you gentlemen could look at the poor lad's face." Algernon nodded. He lifted a corner of the sheet and peered for an instant intently into what remained of poor Kinney's countenance. Then, with a shudder, he surrendered his place to Mr. Scollard. It is to Mr. Scollard's credit that he did not cry out. Only the trembling of his lower lip betrayed the revulsion which filled him. "He was found on the floor in the corridor about 2 hours ago," explained the detective. "But the guy who found him isn't here. They got him in a straitjacket down at Bellevue, and it doesn't look as though he'll be much help to us. He was yelling his head off about something he said came out of hell when they put him in the ambulance. That's what drew the crowd." You don't think Williams could have done it?" murmured Algernon. "Not a chance. But he saw a murderer all right, and if we can get him to talk—" He wheeled on Algernon sharply. "You seem to know something about this, sir." "Only what we picked up downstairs. We had a talk with one of the attendants, and he explained about Williams, and, well, the Chinaman." The detective's eyes glowed. "The Chinaman? What Chinaman? Is there a Chinaman mixed up in this? That's what I've been thinking all along. I didn't have much to go on." "I fear we've become involved in a vicious circle," said Algernon. "It was your Chinaman I was referring to. Willie said you were labouring under the impression that all you had to do to solve this distressing affair was to catch a Chinaman." The detective shook his head. "It's not as simple as that," he affirmed. "We haven't any positive evidence that a Chinaman did it. Might have been a Hap or a Hindu, even a South Sea Islander. That is, if South Sea Islanders eat rice." "Rice?" Algernon stared at the detective incredulously. "That's right, in a bowl, with long sticks. I'm no authority at entomology, but it's my guess they don't use chopsticks much outside Asia." He went into Alcove K and returned with a wooden bowl and 2 long splinters of wood. "All those dark spots near the rim are bloodstains," he explained, as he surrendered the gruesome exhibits to Algernon. "Even the rice here is all smeared with blood." Algernon shuddered, and passed the bowl to Scollard, who almost dropped it in his haste to return it to the detective. "Where did you find it?" The president spoke in a subdued whisper. "On the floor in front of the big stone elephant. That's where Kinney was killed. There's blood all over the elephant, if it's supposed to be an elephant." "It isn't, well, strictly speaking, an elephant," said Algernon. "Well, whatever it is, it could tell us what Kinney's murder looked like. I'd give the toes of my left foot if it could talk." "It doesn't talk," said Algernon decisively. "I wasn't wisecracking," admonished the detective. "I was simply pointing out that the elephant could give us the lowdown on a mighty nasty murder." Algernon accepted the rebuke in silence. "There ain't no doubt whether that a Chinaman or a Hindu or some crazy foreigner sneaked in here last night, set himself down in front of that elephant, began eating rice. Maybe he was in a church-going mood and mistook the beast for one of his own heathen gods. Kinda looks like one of them Oriental idols, the ferocious-looking kind you sometimes see in Chinatown store windows." Algernon smiled ironically. "But unquestionably unique," he murmured. The detective nodded. "Yeah, larger, uglier looking, but a heathen statue, all that. I bet it actually was worshipped once. Hindu, China, I wouldn't know, but it sure has the look." "Yes," admitted Algernon, "it is undoubtedly in the religious tradition. For all its hideousness, it has all the earmarks of a quiescent Eastern divinity." "There aren't anything more dangerous than interfering with an Oriental when he's saying his prayers," continued the detective. "I've been in Chinatown raids, I know. Now see what I think happened. Kinney was standing in the corridor, and suddenly hears a Chinaman muttering and mumbling to himself in the dark. He's naturally frightened, and so he rushes in with his pocket light, where an angel would be fearing to tread. The light gets in the Chinaman's eyes, and, well, it sets him off. It's like putting a match to a ton of TNT to throw a light on a Chinaman when he's squatting in the dark in a worship mood. So, well, this Chinaman goes for the kid with a knife. He feels outraged in a religious way. Isn't really himself. Think he's avenging some insult to the idol." Algernon nodded impatiently. "There may be something in your theory, Sergeant, but there's a great deal it doesn't explain. What was it that William saw?" Nothing but Kinney laying dead in the corridor. Nothing but Kinney looking up at him without a face, and that awful heathen animal looking down at him with blood all over its mouth." Algernon started. "Blood on its mouth?" "Sure, all over its mouth, trunk, tusks. Never seen so much blood in my life. That's what William saw. I don't wonder it crumpled the kid up." There was a commotion in the corridor. Someone was sobbing and pleading in a most fantastic way a few yards from where the 3 men were standing. The detective turned and shouted out a curt command. "Whoever that is, bring him here." Came an appalling, ear-harassing shriek, and two plainclothesmen emerged round a bend in the corridor with a diminutive and weeping Oriental spread-eagle between their extended arms. "The Chinaman!" muttered Scarlet in amazement. For a second the detective was too startled to move, and his immobility somehow emboldened the Chinese to break from his captors and prostrate himself upon the floor at Algernon's feet. "You are my friend," he sobbed. "You are a very good man. I saw you in Greenfire Dream. In Dream, when big green animals come down from mountains, I saw you and Gautam Siddhara. Big green animals all want blood. All very much want blood. In Dream, Gautam Siddhara said, they want you. They have determined they make you all dark fire glue. I said, no, please, I said. Then Gautam Siddhara let fall Jewel of Wisdom. Go to museum. Go to big museum round block. Big green animal will eat you quick. He will eat you quick before he make American man dark fire glue. All night I sat here. All night I said, eat please. And big green animal sleep till American man came. Then he moved. Very quickly he moved. He give animal man very bad hug. American man scream and big animal drank all American man's blood. The Oriental was sobbing unrestrainedly. Algernon stopped and lifted him gently to your feet. What is your name? He asked to soothe him. Where do you live? I'm boss big laundry down street, murmured the Chinaman. Name is Shi Ho. Good man, like you. Where did you go when the elephant came to life? The Chinaman's lower lip trembled convulsively. I hid back, big white lady. In spite of the gravity of the situation, Algernon couldn't repress a smile. The big white lady was a statue of Venus Ursine, and was so enormous that it occupied almost the whole of Alcove K. It was a perfect sanctuary, for there was something ludicrously incongruous in a Chinaman seeking refuge in such a place. One of the detectives, however, confirmed the absurdity. That's why we found him, sir. He's lying on his back, wailing and groaning, making faces at the ceiling. He's our man, all right. We'll have the truth out of him in 10 minutes. The chief sergeant nodded. You bet we will. Put the bracelets on him, Jim. Reluctantly, Algernon surrendered Yi Ho to his captors. I suggest you treat him kindly, he said. He had the misfortune to witness a ghastly and unprecedented exaggeration of what Eddington would call the random element in nature, but he's as destitute of criminal proclivities as a Mr. Scarlet here. The detective raised his eyebrows. I don't get it, sir. Are you suggesting we just hold him as material witness? Algernon nodded. If you try any of your revolting third-degree tactics on that poor little man, you'll answer in court to my lawyer. Now, if you don't mind, I'll have a look at Alcove K. The detective scowled. He wanted to tell Algernon to go to hell, but somehow the inflection of authority in the latter's voice glued the eviction to his own tongue, and with a surly shrug he escorted the group into the presence of Chugna Fawn. Sanguinary baptism becomes some gods. Were the gracious figures of the Grecian pantheon to appear to us with blood upon their garments, we should recoil in horror, but we should think the terrible Mithra or the heart-devouring Hitzpukul a trifle unconvincing if they came on our dreams untarnished by the ruddy vintage of sacrifice. Algernon did not at first look directly at Chognaphon. He studied the tiled marble floor about the base of the idol, and tried to make out in the gloom the precise spot where Kinney had lain. The attempt proved confusing. There were dark smudges on almost every other tile, and they were nearly all of equal circumference. Right here's where we found the corpse, said the detective impatiently. Right beneath the trunk of the elephant. Algernon's blood ran cold. Slowly, very slowly, for he feared to confront what stood before him, he raised his eyes until they were level with the detective's shoulders. The detective's shoulders concealed a portion of Chagnaphon, but all of the thing's right side and the extremity of its trunk were hideously visible to Algernon as he stared. He spoke no word. He did not even move, but all of the blood drained out of his lips, leaving them ashen. Mr. Scollard was staring at his subordinate with frightened eyes. You act as though... Good God, man, what is it? It has moved its trunk. Algernon's voice was vibrant with horror. It's moved its trunk since yesterday, and most hideously, I cannot be mistaken. Yesterday was vertical. Today is an upraised position. Mr. Scollard gasped. Are you sure? He muttered. Are you absolutely certain that the trunk wasn't in that position when the guard arrived here? Yes. Yes, not until today, in the excitement. No one has noticed it, but if you call the attendants... Wait! The president had started to do that very thing, but Algernon's automation brought him up short. I shouldn't have suggested that, he murmured in Scollard's ear. The attendants must be questioned. It's all too unattainably ghastly and inexplicable and mad. We've got to keep it out of the papers. Seek a solution secretly. I know someone who may be able to help us. The police can't. That's obvious. The detective was staring at them pityingly. You gentlemen better get out of here, he said. You aren't used to sights like this. When I was new at this game, I made a lot of mistakes. Could hardly stand the sight of a dead man, for instance. Used to hurry things along when there was no real need for haste, which is just about the worst mistake you can make at the preliminary examination stage. With an effort, Algernon mastered his agitation. You're right, Sergeant, he said. Mr. Scollard and I realize that this business is a little too disturbing for sane contemplation, so we'll retire, as you suggest. But I must warn you again, you'd better think twice about treating poor He-Ho as a convicted murderer. In the corridor he drew Mr. Scollard aside, and conversed for a moment urgently in a low voice. Then he approached the detective and handed him a card. If you want me within the next few hours, you'll find me at this address, he said. Mr. Scollard is returning to his home in Brooklyn. You'll find his phone number in the directory, but I hope you won't disturb him unless something really grave turns up. The detective nodded and read aloud the address on Algernon's card. Dr. Henry C. Imbert, F.R.A.S.F.A.G.S. A friend of yours? He asked impertinently. Algernon nodded. Yes, Sergeant. The foremost American ethnologist. Ever hear of him? To Algernon's amazement, the surgeon nodded. Oh, yeah. I got a kind of interest in ethnology once. I was on a queer case about 2 years ago. Old lady got bumped off by a poison arrow, and we had him in for a powwow. He's clever, all right. Gave us all the dope soon as we saw the corpse. Said a little Negro had done it, one of those African pygmies you read about. Followed up the tip, caught the murderer just as he was giving the little fellow a cyanide cigarette to smoke. Oh, he was a shrewd Italian. He got a pygmy in Africa, hid him in a room down in Euston Street, and set him out to rob and bump off old ladies. He was as spry as a monkey, could shinny up a drain pipe in the side of a house in 10 seconds. If it hadn't been for Imbert, we'd never have got our hands on the guy that owned him. Mr. Scollard and Algernon descended the stairs together, but in the vestibule they parted. the president proceeding down the still crowded outer steps in the direction of a bust, while Algernon sought his office in Wing W. "When Imbert sees this," Algernon murmured, as he extracted a photograph of Chalk Fawn from his chaotically littered desk, "he'll be the most disturbed anthropologist that this planet has harbored since the Pleistocene age."